The Department of Justice views crime as a violation against the state, which should be combated through just punishment. It's no wonder that through this framework, the needs of the victims and community are often unaddressed. The person who committed the crime often does not have a chance to tell his side of the story, does not have an opportunity to make things right with the victim and community. People around the world are shifting their perspective of crime back to its roots. A crime is a violation of relationships between people. Minnesota is leading the way in the United States in what is termed restorative justice.
I think of restorative justice as a framework for responding to harm that happens between human beings that helps us to focus on healing. Healing for the person who caused the harm, healing for those who were harmed, and healing for the larger community.
An opportunity to pay attention to people who had been hurt, pay attention to kids who had been hurt, give them an opportunity to speak, and make them active participants in their own healing.
About community and maintaining healthy and safe communities.
We're trying to restore the brokenness and showing the value of all people within the community.
Being able to come to decisions where everyone says, yes, I can support that.
Restorative justice is best described by the three pillars: harms and needs, obligations, and engagement. Harms and needs. Restorative justice looks at the effect of a crime on people and emphasizes meeting the needs of the victim. Obligations. Restorative justice holds that when a harm is created, people have an obligation to make things right to the extent possible. Engagement. Restorative justice actively engages the victim, offender, and community in the justice process.
The picture, the image of what restorative justice looks like in practice is, I think, a kaleidoscope, and that is because each case, each neighborhood, each community, each individual has its own characteristics and therefore requires its own specific way of responding to any harm. Each time that someone uses a restorative response, it will not look exactly like any other time that a restorative response is used. But the totality of that, if all those little pieces are put together, it creates a pattern that indeed has some kind of coherence.
Restorative justice can take many forms. Three common restorative justice models are the circle processes, victim-offender dialogue, and conferencing. In talking circles, a talking piece is passed around the circle so that each person has a chance to speak. In victim-offender dialogue, there is a facilitator, victim, offender, and their supporters. Community conferences invite community members to join in the process. In all three models, the offender explains what happened, the people affected by the crime describe the impact of the offender's behavior, and the group decides together on an action that will restore the relationship.
The Western legal system does have, I think, a lot of important strengths, but I think that there are also weaknesses in the Western legal system, and I think that restorative justice addresses some of those weaknesses in really profound ways. We're operating in a system that is basically strapped. It's state-centered, it's impersonal. There's an emphasis on deficit and loss. The Western legal system encourages us to be punitive.
The emphasis within the punitive model, as its name would imply, seem to be on punishing offenders.
The focus of restorative justice is not on healing. And the focus is largely on a sense of if you caused harm, then you need to suffer. I think the retributive model had an intention of trying to make things right again, but uses further harm in order to balance the equation. Restorative justice is not free of suffering. It's very painful to take responsibility when you cause harm. but the focus is on repair. What needs to happen to make things right again?
The focus was on restoring the harm.
Positive contribution, just instead of the deficit and loss piece.
A neighborhood, faith community, family, school, and workplace.
Wherever there are people, you will find restorative justice.
The Department of Corrections in the early 90s created a task force to explore restorative justice, and I was invited to be a part of that task force. And in '94, they created a full-time position to promote restorative justice around the state, and I applied. Absolutely extraordinary experience. There were 3 of us from 2000 to 2003 who worked full-time promoting restorative justice around the state.
In 1994, I came to the Department of Education, and about a year or so after, pretty close to that time, I started hearing about and learning about restorative justice. Kay Pranis was at the Department of Corrections at the time as a restorative justice planner. And so it was something that people were talking about.
We had state agency level support for restorative approaches, both in the justice system and the schools, from mid to late 90s. There's no other place in the world that had that kind of, made that kind of investment in restorative justice at a state level.
Our mission is to hold offenders accountable and offer opportunities for change while restoring justice for victims and contributing to a safer Minnesota.
Although the Minnesota Department of Corrections still supports restorative justice, the majority of restorative justice work in the state is done through community nonprofits. The largest of these is Restorative Justice Community Action.
The beauty of Restorative Justice Community Action is that it started as a completely grassroots movement. I mean, the organization started because there were a group of frustrated community members that wanted to do something about this persistent low level livability crime.
A lot of the livability crimes were affecting just the sense of safety and of community from downtown. Downtown seemed to be a dumping ground rather than a place where people lived and chose to live. We've grown to serve all of Minneapolis and also have created relationships with Hennepin County in drug court and in youth programs.
My name is Kershell. I live in the Cleveland neighborhood and I've lived there for about 5 years.
I'm Jerry Clark, and we're sitting in Riverview Tower, which is right on the campus of the University of Minnesota, where I started going to school 60 years ago. I've been doing restorative justice work now for about 7 years, and all of it right from this neighborhood, because this is where I love to be.
I'm Josh Williams, and I've lived in the city of Minneapolis for about 3 years now. I'm a civil rights lawyer.
Troy Buda, Lieutenant with the University of Minnesota Police Department.
I think we should measure our criminal justice system by whether or not the intervention strengthened community. So we would measure that by things like, were new positive, healthy connections made that didn't exist before? Were existing relationships strengthened?
I definitely feel that the restorative justice model, and RJCA in particular, has created community ties and strengthened existing ties. And I think some examples are some community members, or rather some referred participants went on to become community members, and they went on to engage with the organization. And I've seen some community members develop friendships and those types of relationships with referred participants. And I've really seen some transformative community conferences, and that's why I'm so passionate about RJCA.
During the conferences, there's a transformation that happens with referred participants where they start to feel like they are part of the community because of the community members' warmness and their openness for dialogue, and that's why I continue to do the work.
I mean, I just think restorative justice is a good program for first offenders, and I think the thought behind it is, you know, they'll learn the lesson the first time around. Plus, they get to see who it actually affects. You know, back in my day when I was growing up, we would just receive a citation for it. Restorative justice, they're meeting the people that they affect, and I think that sits a little deeper than just paying a fine.
And some guy named Aristotle a few thousand years ago said that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And scientists are still working on how that works. And they haven't figured it out yet. But what they do know is that when people of various attitudes and approaches come together, they can come up with solutions that are different from what any one of them would have predicted. And that's what I call the miracle. And I see it happen over and over, and it makes it worthwhile. Every time I go to a conference, I meet some really interesting folks. Most of them I'll never see again, but they always leave with me an impression. They always leave part of themselves with me, and that's what I enjoy. I watch people come in with one attitude, walk out with another attitude. I'm watching a miracle happen.
I hope that in the next generation that people will be having conversations, open, completely honest conversations about issues of race and racism, issues of class, all the issues of difference around which there's enormous pain and historical harm. I think that we can use a restorative framework to actually repair some of the harm of history. Where before restorative justice, it always felt like we were stuck with that pain and harm because it was in the past that we couldn't do anything about it. But restorative justice has taught us around what victims need, that there are things that we could still do today. Listening to the stories over and over again, deeply understanding what the impact has been, what the harm was, validating that people didn't deserve what happened to them. That all of those are things that we can still do today. So my hope for restorative justice is that it moves past street crime, which is important, but is not, in fact, I believe, our most critical issue. Our most critical issue is the deep divisions that we have around difference, racial, ethnic, faith-based kinds of differences that result in a lot of hate talk in our country. And that we could have these conversations and explore differences in a way that doesn't ask people to drop what they believe or feel, but really helps us understand why it looks that way from that person's perspective. That's really, for me, a huge motivator for continuing to do this work.
Yeah, I would say I don't really have anything else to say. That's probably it.
No, I think I said it.
Indeed.
Brenna was a fantastic intern. Fantastic. She set the bar so high.
Questions were great.
Good.
They were great, and they really covered a lot of the interesting places.